Hello and welcome back to our live coverage of the UN Climate Conference here in Tianjin, China. I'm delighted to say that I've been joined by Steve Sawyer, who is from the Global Wind Energy Council, and Barbara Finamore of the Natural Resources Defence Council. We're going to discuss technology a little bit this morning, how it's being used, renewable energies, and where these investments are happening. We've heard a lot about China leading this kind of race to the future, so that's what we're going to try to cover. I guess the first question, though, that might be good to answer is, what is renewable energy? And Steve, I'm going to ask you to deal with this one. So, what is renewable energy?
Well, I mean, the simplest definition would be one that relies on the, in relative terms, inexhaustible flows of the natural systems of the Earth and the universe, all beginning and generated initially by the fusion reaction that happens at the core of the sun. And that covers, as it gets expressed in terms of technology, it's wind, wave, solar, and geothermal, if you want to put it on those terms. And of course, the big one is hydro for the electricity sector, and also the sustainable use of biomass resources to generate heat or electricity or liquid fuels for transport.
Okay, so there's quite a few options there on the table. Are these already kind of in place? Can we use all of these sources of energy? Does this technology exist already?
All the technologies exist. I mean, there are new ones being developed all the time in terms of different ways of converting the natural energy in the ecosystem and in the solar system, if you will. There are different stages of technological development and different stages of deployment in different parts of the world, and at different prices and different costs, which play out differently depending on what resources are available and what they're competing with.
Okay, so I guess this leads me to my first question for you, Barbara. We've heard Steve say there that these technologies are being used in different ways in different parts of the world, and we've heard a lot here in China about how they're really leading investment in renewable energy. Is that something that why is that happening? Why is China kind of leading this race?
China sees renewable energy as a key element in its drive to achieve energy independence, reduce the choking smog that is you all experienced here in Tianjin and elsewhere in China, improve the health of its people, avoid the threats to agriculture from acid rain. China is the leading source and sufferer of acid rain in the country, and also to help with reducing climate change. The impacts on China of climate change are predicted to be devastating and are already being felt.
So what kind of investment are we seeing here in China? I don't know who the best person to pitch this question is to.
Yeah. China invested $34.6 billion in clean energy finance and investment last year. That is more by far than any other country. It's about twice that of the next leading country, the U.S., which was only about $18 billion.
So what are the repercussions of this? We've heard a lot about the fact that this new kind of green economy is going to be a big bucks. Are we going to see China dominating this? Do you think? Are they dominating it at the moment?
Well, it depends on the technology. They dove into the solar PV manufacturing sector a few years ago, and have now had a major impact on the global market, and have provided low-cost quality products to really have put the American and European producers on their toes and have driven down the cost of the technology overall. The same is true in the wind sector, but in a different way, in the sense that you're talking about very large pieces of equipment, and so the logistics and the economics of shipping them around the world are very different than solar. So the vast majority of the manufacturing in China is for Chinese consumption, and so what's happened over the course of the last 5 years is that the Chinese wind industry has come from being a small, minor player to the dominant global market. China is now the largest manufacturing company for wind turbines. All of the major manufacturers, international manufacturers, have come here and are building, and 5 out of the top 15 manufacturers in the world, including numbers 3 and number 5, are Chinese companies now, which nobody had ever heard of 5 years ago. So it's been an amazing transformation of the sector overall in a very, very short period of time.
Well, in our morning show yesterday, we discussed a little bit about US politics and about US attitudes towards climate change. And I don't know, perhaps this is as a British person, but as the perception of the US from the outside often is as this country that's like leading in terms of technology and a real kind of pride in innovating in its kind of corporate sector. How is it that it's kind of been left behind? You said investments less than half in China. Why is that?
I think U.S. still leads in innovation, there's a lot of work being going on throughout the country to develop these new forms of renewable energy. What's lacking in the U.S. is political will to enact the sort of national policies that will help renewable energy to scale up, as we're seeing here in China. The failure to pass comprehensive climate and energy legislation was a real blow for the United States. And even now, the debate on passing a national renewable energy standard, which would require all utilities to purchase a certain percentage of renewable energy, is still languishing in the U.S. Congress. So what do you see as a result there is that Ernst & Young just has been doing studies every year of how attractive different countries are for investment in renewable energy. And as early as this last quarter, the first quarter of 2010, the U.S. and China were tied for first place. And now the U.S. has dropped down to second, just because of the failure to enact these kind of national policies that the renewable energy industry, which is still very small and very new compared to the fossil fuel industry, needs in order to scale up nationwide.
So what are the implications of this then in terms of jobs? Like how many jobs are we talking? Because we heard that foreign direct investment in China in China's renewables is massive. Are we seeing jobs kind of moving away from one country to another, or is it not like that? What's the?
Well, I mean, I can take the wind industry as an example. I mean, because of the on-again, off-again nature of the support system for wind power, for instance, in the U.S., there was an enormous growth over the past 3 years. Employment shot up to about 85,000, but over the last 18 months now, that number's remained more or less stagnant because of the expiry of the existing situation, the lack of a clear national framework. And meanwhile, the jobs in the wind sector in China are more than double that now, and rising very rapidly. And you see a shift in both production and operations in both the wind and solar sectors from Europe and North America to China now, simply because the Chinese government has created a much more attractive environment for investors.
Okay, but it seems a bit simple. Is it just the politics in the US that's holding it back, there, or are there technological problems? Like it's literally just the politics.
Well, Barbara probably spends more time in Washington than I do, but I think that's.
Many of the senators who were not willing to vote for U.S. climate legislation characterized this legislation as a jobs killer. So I think they have the absolutely wrong impression of what such legislation would do for the United States. The Pew Environmental Center did a study of all the G20 countries, and it found that it is for the countries that were enacting these strong national policies and also financial incentives, rebates, requirements that utilities purchase renewable energy at a certain price. All these policies were causing these countries to assume leadership in the clean energy emerging sector, which some people estimate will be up to $13 trillion. So it found the countries that were moving ahead, like China, Germany, Spain, those are the countries that have enacted these national policies. The countries that haven't, which include the United States and even Japan, don't have those national policies. They are lagging behind. So I think there's a misconception of this legislation as a job killer rather than a job creator.
I guess it all seems quite positive so far when it comes to renewables. Why are we still using coal and oil? Like, where has this perception come from? Like, what's the benefit of coal?
Well, the benefit of coal is that it's cheap, and if you're in a country where it's just sitting on a pile of coal, it's easy to get at. So it solves your energy security situation, and it's economically advantageous if you don't count the costs of the CO2 pollution, the cost of the damage to the infrastructure and to the agriculture from acid rain, if you don't count the costs of the human health impacts of climate change, of pollution from coal-fired power plants, if you don't count the waste and pollution of huge quantities of water in the mining and the extraction and the processing and the disposal of the waste associated with it. If you don't count all of those things, then coal is really cheap.
Right, okay.
And one way to get at that situation in order to have the cost of coal reflect its true price, and in that I would also include the severe mining, disasters, mining deaths, which are particularly egregious here in China. One way to do that is to enact a carbon tax. Now, that's a term that any politician in the United States is afraid to say. They feel it will be political death, but China is now debating whether or not it should include a carbon tax in its next 5-year plan, because they realize that's a way to level the playing field for renewable energy, cleaner sources of energy, and help China to wean itself away from coal, which right now provides about 70% of China's total energy needs.
You mentioned the role of politicians there and kind of political death associated with mentioning the word tax. How much leadership has there been on this issue? I noticed yesterday Obama's come out and said he's going to put solar on the White House, which is quite a brave decision, I guess, to some extent. But that's a good signal. Should we expect real movement in the US over the next couple of years? And what's the situation in China?
He's reinstalling the solar system that Jimmy Carter installed in the late 70s, and which the Reagan administration unceremoniously ripped off in the early part of the 80s. I mean, and I think that sort of points to the difficulties that faces with the situation in the U.S., and that leadership from the White House is one thing, and it's necessary, and it's an absolute precondition to moving forward with this, but it is only one part of the puzzle, and you need a way to convince the Congress, enough of the Congress, to go along and try to create a national coherent energy strategy, which, the United States has been struggling with since the first oil shocks in the 70s, and has never really had a coherent and effective national energy policy. I mean, I don't remember the exact numbers, but I believe in 1973, when the first oil shock hit, the U.S. relied on about 45% imported oil. Now that's about 70%. I think that points to the effectiveness of the national policy on the subject over the last 35 years.
Why is this debate not something that unites kind of different parties in different countries? Because it seems like the benefits are clear in terms of health. There's massive social and environmental problems associated with the use of dirty fossil fuels, and you only have to look to the Gulf of Mexico to see the environmental consequences in a very kind of direct way. And then you've raised this issue of energy security, which is something that from the outside I'd presume that Republicans in the US would be very concerned about. How has this become such a divisive issue?
I think there is strong bipartisan support for things like a renewable energy standard, and I'm hoping that we will expect to see that, because a carbon tax is not the only answer, of course. There's many other ways to improve the support for renewable energy in the U.S. I would also agree with you when you talk about national security. The interesting thing is that so many military leaders in the United States have begun to come out in support of renewable energy because of its impact on national security. And I'd also say the U.S. military just announced the other day a new policy to increase the use of renewable energy within the military in order to ensure a supply that's going to continue and not be threatened by other countries.
And so,
I just would like to augment that by the fact that it's ironic that the U.S. Air Force may in fact be the entity that pioneers the use of biofuels in air transport and really refines it to the point and makes it commercially viable for the rest of the world, because they are quite rationally concerned about fuel supplies, especially when they're deployed afield.